Uh, Good evening, everyone. And first and foremost, I would like to thank Deepak ji for giving us this great opportunity to talk about the subject of data governance. In fact, when we were discussing with Deepak ji about the whole context of this session, we were really pleased to know that the context of this session actually talks about cyber and data security, which effectively, gives us a lot of encouragement that we are having data security come to fore in terms of discussion at such large forums and enterprise-wide. I'm not going to go too deep dive into the whole context of what Varonis does in the context of being an OEM in the data governance space. But here I would like to put up some perspectives, some ideas that how the entire context of governance around data is shaping in India as well as globally. The topic which I have selected for today talks about embracing data democratization with effective data governance. What is data democratization? We talk about breach prevention, we talk about endpoint security, we talk about breach and simulation attacks. But ultimately, if you really look at your organization today, data democracy is something which you cannot really avoid, which means any user, any employee in your organization today needs to have an unabated access, unrestricted access to any amount of data that they need in order to have the right amount of business productivity. But with this, the challenge which this concept throws back to us security professionals is that while the democratization of data is needed, it also needs to have the right channels of protection and governance principles around it, that how we can secure the entire context, and hence the subject of my discussion today, which is on data democracy. Well, data is the new oil, data is the new gold, I think has already achieved a cliched status, so there's no point in repeating that context again. But the whole context of data, why is it so important today, is because the data has a huge capability to be monetized. Data today is being monetized for all the business benefits. We look at all the B2C interactions, we look at B2B interactions from where we see R&D departments, innovation departments leveraging on data. So data is truly being monetized in ways that we can't really have our thoughts to also. But the entire context being that with this data monetization, it also brings a huge amount of risk to manage the data effectively. Well, organizations, a few years back, started with having an on-prem file servers or Windows file servers or Unix file servers. Then SAN, NAS came into picture to store data. But many of the logos, and this is just a glimpse of it, there are many, many more, I've just put it. These are the typical data stores which an enterprise today uses to store their data, to operate their data. And you can see that apart from the typical on-prem installations, we have grown into cloud. The reason why I mentioned this slide here is that actually, if you look the whole context, what we are trying to protect in an organization is actually the data. Data is actually the attack surface that any CISO, any CTO, any CIO would want to protect. All these security controls that we talk about, endpoint, WAF, SIEM, SOC controls, ultimately do what? They are there to protect the data ultimately, and that's the whole context. And the most important perspective that I want to add is that data is the true attack surface that we need to protect ultimately. The real challenge of protecting data, as I have briefly mentioned earlier, is that when you have a lot of data stores and collaboration technologies from which you really collaborate on a daily basis, you cannot stop this collaboration from happening in an enterprise because it is ultimately needed for the business outcomes that you are looking for. But this throws a challenge back to us that while this collaboration needs to happen, it's mandatory, do we have sufficient controls to ensure that the protection is there? Many of our peers here have already implemented a lot of technologies which talk about the prevention of data not going out from different channels or different vectors, but the whole context being that the dynamics of data protection are so different today from what it used to be even 2 years back that it needs a whole new dimension, and that is where the governance of data comes into picture. A typical employee in a 8 to 10,000 user firm today has an access to roughly 17 million files. I think earlier in one of the fireside chats, we heard the access of data being one of the critical elements to secure the attack surface. Now in an enterprise today, we talk about this is the scale and size of a file access that a typical employee has. Now this we call in our terminology as blast radius. Now this blast radius means that if Ravish has an access to say 10 million files and I only need about 1% of the files for my actual use, if I get compromised, then I would naturally infect and have malicious activity around that particular data, and 10 million files is a lot of data. What the principal context of data governance tool today or products today talks about the context of reducing this attack surface from a 17 million to 1 or 2 or 3% of data that the user actually needs to do the right kind of work ultimately. So if we are able to reduce this kind of blast radius, we will naturally have the right access mechanisms to control it in the context of it. While we discuss, and I think the context is that none of the discussions that ideally we prefer or we want to do ever with our customers would be around tool, technology, product. It needs to be around a concept and how we are able to seep that right into the business process part of it. So if data is the ultimate context that we need to save in our respective organizations, shouldn't we have a process or mechanism in place where we build the security programs which in fact start from data first? So in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about the context that if we can build a data first security program in our organization, rather than having tools and technologies around data to protect it, but have a technology within the data to be protected itself. Now this is a typical landscape. We have endpoints, we have gateways, we have servers in every organization, and we have multiple technologies through which organizations protect. This is a typical scenario with any enterprise today. And these tools are needed. I'm not talking from context that these are not important, but these are all needed. But when they are all needed, what we ultimately do is we send these alerts back to the SIEM and then throw a very fancy AI tool to kind of analyze that what has really happened. I think all of this is what we are doing right now. And ultimately, we blame SIEM, of course, because if you throw garbage at it, you will get garbage out of it. Very simple as that. Ultimately, the context here being that this is the way we are trying to protect data as of today in our enterprise. The way we try to look at it slightly differently and a little more effectively is that if those are the data stores which you ultimately want to protect, those data stores are Office 365, file servers, any cloud estate, GitHub, AWS, Google, all of the sorts, and this is where we really start the building up the process of data, and then you build a context backwards and integrate it so that your cloud, your on-prem, your hybrid estates are all protected in this way by taking the right context of governance around data. There are three principal measures of governance that we need to be aware of, and these are all very simple questions, simple pointers, but unfortunately overseen and not paid sufficient attention to. If we look at these three dimensions of data security in our environment, I think we will be pretty much cognizant, aware, and protective about the data. Number one is that we need to understand what kind of data do we really have, what is the important data that we have. So once you know that, once you have identified that this is my important data, GDPR, PII, PCI, or any kind of KYC documents for that matter, once we know that data is critical, then we should be able to assess that is my data being used effectively? Do people have the right access and permissions to the data? Is my data not overexposed to people who they are not supposed to? Is my data being with the right set of people in the real-time basis? Because, like I mentioned, collaboration really cannot stop. And with that collaboration, the tangents or the baselines that you really set for data access go haywire on a day-to-day basis. And third is the accessibility part of it. Now, if I have the right technology to ensure that the data threat detection response I am able to build through my platform. Now, data security in itself is a context which is a perimeter to be protected. Many of the terms and technologies which are mentioned here are already part of your ecosystem, many of them. But now, if we look at data security in particular, you need to talk about the context of discovering the data. You need to have data security posture management in place so that you have a continuous compliance management, continuous access mechanisms of data, and more importantly, the SOC and the SIEM setups that we have today are predominantly based on 3 I's, which is incidents, infrastructure, and identities. Today, majority of the SOCs do not really have any visibility to what's really happening on data, and that is where the data access control and data detection response comes into picture. You know, any kind of ransomware, any kind of APT, malware ultimately has ambition to really take the data out. And it really starts from those small activities and it kind of spirals out of control. So what governance really talks about is that each and every user touch needs to be monitored with the same level of severity as you would do in a post-breach analysis as well. Well, I have not really talked much about, and I have a very short video to let you know what Varonis really does in the space, and I would further conclude my presentation. Great. So just one thought to it. I think the last message, the most effective way to look at protecting your data is that we need to have the protection measures at a greater scale than the ability that we are creating the data. So that's the message, and of course, my coordinates are here with, and we'd love to interact with you separately as we needed. Yeah, thank you.